My beloved child. Stop scrolling for just a moment. Do not rush past this message. Something has shifted. Something you cannot see yet has already begun moving behind the scenes, and the reason you are hearing these words at this exact moment is not because you randomly found them. In this fictional spiritual story, heaven has allowed a message to reach you at the precise moment when your heart needs to hear it. There is someone whose heart has been carrying a weight they have not known how to explain. Someone who has tried to continue their day normally. Someone who has smiled when they were expected to smile, answered when they were expected to answer, and pretended that everything was under control. But something happened. And after that moment, they could no longer keep pretending that they were unaffected by you. Pause here. Take a breath. Because what happened next changed the way they were looking at everything. They thought they could keep their feelings hidden. They thought distance would make the emotions disappear. They thought time would weaken whatever connection existed between you. But tonight, in the atmosphere of this story, something unexpected has forced them to confront a truth they had been avoiding. They need you now. Not because they suddenly became weak. Not because they have nowhere else to turn. But because something inside them has reached a point where pretending no longer works. And there is one detail about what happened that they never expected you to discover. That detail is where this story begins. You may have felt strangely restless lately. Perhaps you could not explain why your thoughts kept returning to this person. Perhaps you suddenly remembered an old conversation. Perhaps a song, a photograph, a familiar place, or even a completely ordinary moment brought their face into your mind. Maybe you dismissed it. Maybe you told yourself, it means nothing. But then the feeling returned. And then it returned again. Almost as though an invisible thread kept pulling your attention towards something unfinished. In this fictional spiritual narrative, that thread represents something deeper than ordinary memory. It represents the emotional truth that two people can sometimes leave a conversation unfinished even after the words have stopped. There are things that were never said. Apologies that were never offered. Questions that were never answered. Feelings that were never given a safe place to exist. And your soulmate, in this story, has been living inside that silence. They have been replaying moments with you. Not just the beautiful ones. The painful ones too. The moment they should have stayed. The moment they walked away. The moment they wanted to speak but remained silent. The moment they saw your expression change and realized they had hurt you. The moment you stopped explaining yourself. That one may have stayed with them longer than you realize. Because sometimes a person does not understand the value of your presence until your absence becomes louder than your voice ever was. And now something has happened that made your absence impossible for them to ignore. It may have been a simple conversation. A name mentioned unexpectedly. A photograph appearing somewhere. A place they passed. A question someone asked. Or perhaps they heard something about you that they were completely unprepared to hear. Whatever the event was, it opened a door inside them. And behind that door was everything they had been trying not to feel. At first, they tried to dismiss it. They told themselves they were overthinking. They told themselves it was nostalgia. They told themselves everyone experiences memories like this. But then they noticed something. Their heart reacted before their mind could create an explanation. And that frightened them. Because they had built an entire emotional defense around the belief that they could control what they felt for you. They believed they had mastered the art of appearing unaffected. They could talk normally. They could laugh. They could stay busy. They could avoid your name. They could tell other people that everything was fine. But they could not control what happened when they were alone. That is where the truth waited. Late at night, when there were no distractions, your memory returned. And this time it did not feel like an ordinary memory. It felt like a question. What if I had chosen differently? What if I had been honest? What if I had not walked away? What if they still care? And then came the question they were most afraid to ask themselves. What if I have already lost them? My beloved child, sometimes the greatest awakening does not arrive through a dramatic event. Sometimes it arrives through a quiet realization that suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. A person can spend months convincing themselves that they made the right decision. Then one moment can make every excuse collapse. That is what happened here. Something cracked. Not necessarily between you and them. Inside them. The wall they built around their emotions developed a fracture. And through that fracture came everything they had buried. The memories. The longing. The regret. The tenderness. The fear. And above all, the realization that there was something about you they had never truly replaced. They had tried. Perhaps they met other people. Perhaps they surrounded themselves with friends. Perhaps they filled their schedule until there was no room left for silence. Perhaps they convinced themselves that moving forward meant forgetting. But forgetting you never happened. They simply became better at hiding the fact that they remembered. And now something has brought those memories back to the surface. But there is more. Much more. Because what happened did not merely make them think about you. It made them realize something about themselves. They realized how much of their behavior had been driven by fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of being seen. Fear that if they admitted how deeply they cared, they would lose control. So they chose silence. And silence protected them for a while. Until silence became the very thing hurting them. Imagine standing in a room full of people and suddenly hearing a sentence that reminds you of someone you have tried desperately not to think about. You smile. You pretend nothing happened. But inside, your entire emotional world stops. That is the atmosphere surrounding this story. Someone said something. A memory surfaced. And your soulmate froze. For a few seconds, they were somewhere else entirely. They were back in a moment with you. They remembered your voice. Your expression. The way you looked at them. Something small that you probably forgot. But they remembered. That is the strange thing about emotional connections. One person may forget the details while the other person keeps them stored like precious fragments. A particular sentence. A certain laugh. A gesture. The way you looked away when you were hurt. The way you tried to appear stronger than you felt. The way you cared without demanding recognition. Your soulmate remembered those things. And suddenly they understood something they had never understood before. You were never asking them to be perfect. You were asking them to be honest. And they were not. That realization hurt. It hurt because it removed the easiest excuse. They could no longer blame circumstances for everything. They had to admit that some of the distance came from their own choices. Some of the silence came from their own fear. Some of the pain came from their own inability to communicate. And that is when their heart began asking a dangerous question. Is it too late? That question stayed with them. They carried it through the day. They carried it while working. They carried it while talking to others. They carried it while trying to sleep. And eventually, they did something they had been resisting. They searched for some sign of you. Maybe they looked at an old message. Maybe they opened a photograph. Maybe they searched your name. Maybe they visited a place connected to you. Maybe they simply sat quietly and admitted to themselves that they missed you. But whatever form it took, the action mattered. Because it meant the emotional door was no longer completely closed. And then came another unexpected moment. They discovered something about you. Something they had never known. Something you had kept hidden. Something you never showed them because you never believed you needed to prove yourself. And when they discovered it, they were shocked. Not because it was something impossible. but because it revealed a side of you they had completely underestimated. You had a talent, a strength, a gift, a way of thinking, a creative ability, a quiet brilliance. Something you carried without making noise about it. And suddenly your soulmate began seeing old memories differently. They remembered moments when you tried to tell them something. They remembered moments when you were passionate about an idea. They remembered the way you became completely different when you spoke about something you loved. And they realized they had not been paying enough attention. They had been looking at the surface. You had been living beneath it. That realization shook them. Because suddenly they understood that they never truly knew the whole person standing in front of them. They knew parts of you. But not all of you. And now they wanted to know more. That curiosity became emotional hunger. They wanted to understand you. They wanted to know what you had been doing when they were not around. What dreams you had abandoned. What dreams you were still secretly pursuing. What made you happy? What made you cry? What you feared? What you never told anyone? And most importantly, they wanted to know whether there was still a place for them in your world. But there was one problem. They did not know how to approach you. Because approaching you would require them to admit something. They would have to acknowledge that they had been wrong. And pride is strange. A person can miss you desperately and still stare at their phone without sending the message. They can type your name and erase it. They can write 3 paragraphs and delete them. They can rehearse an apology in their head and then convince themselves that silence is safer. That is exactly where your soulmate found themselves. Standing between desire and fear. Wanting to reach you. Terrified of what would happen if they did. And then something else happened. Something that changed the urgency. They realized you might not be waiting anymore. That possibility hit them harder than anything else. Maybe you had changed. Maybe you had healed. Maybe you had grown beyond the version of yourself they remembered. Maybe your heart had learned to live without them. Maybe someone else had entered your life. Maybe you had finally stopped looking backward. And for the first time, they understood that time was not automatically working in their favor. Time could heal you. Time could strengthen you. Time could teach you how to let go. And if they waited too long, they might eventually become a memory in your life instead of a person in your future. That thought terrified them. Not because they wanted to possess you, but because they finally understood the consequences of hesitation. They had assumed there would always be another chance. Another conversation. Another opportunity. Another moment. But life does not promise another moment. And sometimes the heart realizes that only after the opportunity begins slipping away. That is why the energy of this story feels urgent. Your soulmate is not simply remembering you. They are confronting the possibility of losing access to the person they never stopped caring about. And there is a difference. A memory can be comfortable. Regret is not. Regret asks questions. Regret does not let you sleep easily. Regret brings old conversations back at inconvenient times. Regret makes ordinary places feel haunted by possibilities. And your soulmate has been walking through those possibilities. What if I had called? What if I had stayed? What if I had told the truth? What if they were the person I was supposed to recognize? And then they reached a thought that frightened them more than all the others. What if I walked away from something rare? That question changed everything. Because until that moment, they had been trying to understand what they felt. After that moment, they began wondering what they needed to do. And those are 2 completely different stages. Feeling something is passive. Doing something requires courage. Your soulmate was approaching the edge between the 2. But before they could act, another piece of the story surfaced. Something from the past. Something they had misunderstood. Something involving you. They discovered that there was a reason behind one of your actions that they had never understood. They had interpreted your silence as indifference. But it may have been protection. They had interpreted your distance as rejection. But perhaps you were wounded. They had interpreted your strength as lack of emotion. But perhaps you were simply trying not to break. And suddenly, an old memory became painful in a completely different way. They realized they may have judged you without knowing what you were carrying. That realization made them emotional. Because it is difficult to discover that the person you thought was pushing you away may have actually been waiting for you to understand them. And now they wondered whether you still had the strength to forgive them. That is the question they cannot answer. And it is the question that keeps them awake. Because somewhere inside, they know an apology may not be enough. Words may not repair everything. They may need to demonstrate change. They may need to prove that the person approaching you now is not the same person who walked away before. And that is why they have been hesitating. They know that if they return, they cannot return with empty promises. They cannot return simply because they miss you. They cannot knock on the door of your heart carrying the same old patterns. Something has to be different. They know it. And perhaps that is why this story has not reached its most important moment yet. Because before your soulmate can come toward you, they have to face the one person they have been avoiding. Themselves. There are battles nobody sees. A person can appear completely calm while fighting an enormous war inside. They can post pictures. They can laugh. They can go to work. They can sit with family. They can answer messages. And still feel like something inside them is collapsing. Your soulmate has been fighting that invisible battle. They have been asking themselves whether love is worth the vulnerability it requires. They have been asking whether they can risk being rejected. Whether they can risk hearing that you have moved on. Whether they can risk discovering that the door they are finally ready to open is already closed. But eventually, fear becomes exhausting. And exhaustion can produce honesty. That is where they are now. Tired of pretending. Tired of running. Tired of acting as though they do not care. Tired of wondering. Tired of carrying words that have nowhere to go. And then, in a quiet moment, they admitted the truth. They still love you. Not necessarily in the perfect cinematic way people imagine love. Not as a fantasy. But as something complicated. Something carrying regret. Something carrying growth. Something carrying the knowledge that love without courage can still create distance. They realized they had mistaken emotional control for emotional maturity. They thought hiding their feelings made them strong. Now they understand that sometimes strength means saying the thing you are terrified to say. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because your soulmate was not the only person noticing the change. Someone else noticed. Someone close to them. Someone who had watched the situation for longer than you realize. This person saw the way your soulmate changed whenever your name appeared. They noticed the silence. They noticed the expression. They noticed the sudden distraction. They noticed how quickly the subject was changed. And eventually, this person asked the question your soulmate had been avoiding. Do you still love them? Silence. No answer. Just a long pause. And sometimes silence is an answer. Your soulmate could have laughed. They could have denied it. They could have said, of course not. But they did not. They simply looked away. And that person understood. They knew. The secret was no longer completely hidden. Then came another question. If you care that much, why don't you tell them? That question struck deep. Because your soulmate had no easy answer. They could not say they did not care. They could not say they were ready. They could not explain the fear. They could only admit that they did not know what would happen if they reached out. And then the person beside them said something your soulmate never expected to hear. Something that forced them to reconsider everything. They said, in essence, that if you truly matter, then silence is also a choice. And your soulmate realized something. Doing nothing was not neutral. Every day they stayed silent was another day you lived without knowing the truth. Every day they waited was another day you could move farther away. Every day they protected themselves from rejection was another day they risked permanent regret. That was the moment urgency became real. They reached for their phone. They opened your conversation. They stared at your name. Their finger hovered. And then they stopped. Because one memory came rushing back. A memory of you trusting them. A memory of you being vulnerable. A memory of them failing to respond the way you deserved. Their hand lowered. They could not send a casual message. Not this time. They knew a simple, "hey," would not carry what needed to be said. So they began writing. They wrote one sentence. Deleted it. Wrote another. Deleted that too. They tried to explain. It sounded like an excuse. They tried to apologize. It sounded too small. They tried to say they missed you. It sounded incomplete. Because what they really wanted to say was much bigger. I finally understand. But understand what? That they loved you? That they were afraid? That they regretted leaving? That they had been wrong? That they had discovered something about you that made them admire you in a way they never had before? All of it. And none of it fit into one message. So they stopped typing. They placed the phone down. They walked away. But the story did not end there. Because later that night, something happened that they could not explain. They encountered a reminder of you again. Another coincidence. Another memory. Another unexpected connection. And this time they did not dismiss it. They sat quietly. They allowed themselves to feel everything. And for the first time, they stopped asking, "Why am I still thinking about this person?" Instead, they asked, "What am I supposed to do with what I feel?" That is a much more dangerous question. Because once the heart asks what it should do, excuses begin losing their power. And your soulmate knew the answer was approaching. They did not know whether the answer would be reconciliation. They did not know whether you would forgive them. They did not know whether you would even respond. But they knew one thing. They could no longer continue living in uncertainty. And that is why, in this fictional spiritual message, their heart feels like it is standing at the edge of a decision. Something is coming. A conversation. A confession. A revelation. A message. But before it arrives, there is something you need to understand. Your soulmate's urgency is not the same as your responsibility. You are not required to abandon your peace just because someone finally understands your value. You are not required to reopen a door simply because someone regrets closing it. You are not required to chase. You are not required to prove anything. Your role is not to rescue someone from the consequences of their choices. Your role is to remain grounded in who you have become. That is important. Because perhaps the greatest transformation in this story is not what your soulmate is doing. It is what you have become while they were away. You survived the silence. You survived the uncertainty. You survived nights when you wondered whether you had imagined the connection. You survived moments when you wanted answers and received none. You learned how to keep moving. You learned how to smile again. You learned that your worth was never determined by whether someone chose you. And now, if they return, they are not returning to the same person they left. They are approaching someone stronger. Someone wiser. Someone who knows the difference between longing and love. Someone who understands that real connection requires action. And perhaps that is why they are nervous. Because they can feel that you have changed. Even without speaking to you, they sense it. The version of you they remember may have waited. The version of you that exists now knows how to walk away. That difference is everything. And just when they thought they had finally gathered enough courage to reach out, something happened that made them freeze again. They saw something. Something connected to your hidden talent. Something that revealed how much you had grown. Something that made them realize you had been building a life while they were standing still. They watched quietly. And the emotion that appeared first was pride. Then admiration. Then regret. Then fear. Because suddenly they wondered whether you had become too far ahead for them to catch up. They wondered whether you still needed them. And that thought hurt. Because they had always imagined themselves as someone important in your story. Now they were afraid they might have become someone from your past. Someone you once loved. Someone you once trusted. Someone whose name still carried emotion but no longer carried power. That possibility broke something inside them. And then came the most vulnerable thought of all. What if they are finally happy without me? They sat with that thought. And instead of becoming angry, they became quiet. Because deep down, if they truly loved you, they wanted your happiness even if it did not include them. That realization was painful. But it was also a sign of growth. For perhaps the first time, they were thinking about your happiness instead of their own fear. And that changed the nature of what they wanted. They did not simply want you back. They wanted to become worthy of being welcomed back. There is a difference. And that difference may become the most important part of what happens next. Because someone is preparing to tell them something. Something they do not yet know. Something about the past. Something about you. Something that may explain why the connection between you became so complicated. Your soulmate is about to hear information that will force them to rethink a moment they thought they understood. And when they hear it, their first reaction will not be relief. It will be shock. Because the story they have been telling themselves about you is incomplete. There was something you never told them. Not because you wanted to manipulate them. Not because you wanted them to suffer. But because the circumstances never gave you a safe place to say it. And now, that truth is moving toward them. Someone else knows. Someone who was there. Someone who remembers. Someone who has remained silent. Until now. And when this person finally speaks, your soulmate will realize that the past was not what they thought it was. They will discover that one of the moments they considered the ending may actually have been the beginning of a completely different story. Their heart will race. They will ask questions. They will demand details. And one sentence will change the entire atmosphere. A sentence that makes them realize you were carrying something alone. Something they should have known. Something that could have changed everything if they had understood it sooner. And this is where the urgency becomes impossible to ignore. Because once they hear that truth, they will have a choice. Stay silent and live with the knowledge. Or finally come toward you. And my beloved child, the person who has been afraid of losing you is approaching that choice right now. They have their phone nearby. They have your name in their thoughts. They have words forming in their heart. But there is one final piece missing. They need to know whether you would listen. They need to know whether you would let them speak. They need to know whether the person they remember still exists somewhere beneath everything that happened. And they are about to find out. Because the person carrying the secret has decided they can no longer remain silent. They are preparing to reveal what happened. And your soulmate has absolutely no idea what they are about to hear. The revelation will explain the distance. It will explain the silence. It will explain why one moment between you became so important. And most importantly, it will reveal something about your soulmate's own past that they have never told you. Something they have been ashamed of. Something they believed would make you see them differently. something they thought they could bury forever. But secrets have a way of resurfacing when the heart is finally ready to confront them. And your soulmate is standing at that threshold now. Their hand is reaching for the truth. Their defenses are falling. Their pride is weakening. Their heart is opening. But before they can reach you, they must hear what has been hidden. And when those words finally reach them, they will realize why you came into their life when you did. They will understand why the connection never completely disappeared. They will understand why every attempt to forget you eventually failed. And they will discover that the thing they thought was coincidence may have been connected to a much deeper emotional turning point. But there is one detail they still do not know. One detail about you. One thing you did after they left. One quiet decision you made that nobody noticed. And when your soulmate discovers it, their entire expression will change. Because they will realize that while they were struggling to understand their feelings, you were quietly preparing to let them go. And that is the truth they were never ready to hear. The truth that may determine whether they finally come toward you, or lose the chance forever. And the next thing they discover about that decision will leave them completely speechless.